Established in January 1974, Kerry Cooperative Creameries Limited, or Kerry Co-op, celebrates a special anniversary, 50 years. This podcast series has been created by Mary Lavery Carrig, based on the first board photographed together in January 1974. This is Mary, and you are welcome to A Chat with Mary, Voices from Kerry Co-op's story. In this episode, episode 4, we hear from Kieran O'Shea. His late father, James, or Jimmy O'Shea, from Killahan, Beaufort, played an active part in Kerry Co-op in the early days. Here is what his son Kieran has to say.
Jimmy O'Shea was born in this farm January 1931. He had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. There were always dairy farming here. His father died when he was young. He stayed at home with his mother. He didn't want to stay at home. He wanted to travel, but he had to at the time stay at home with his mother. And he later started a good dairy farm here. He was very progressive at the time, but there was always something that he was always looking over the horizon at something greater than what he had. He was in the County Committee of Agriculture. He was very involved in politics over the years, and particularly farming politics. He's come up with a lot of schemes when he was in the County Committee of Agriculture. Some of them came into fruition, more of them didn't. But one thing he always had in the back of his head was to amalgamate all the small dairy farmers in Kerry into one big group. Now, he didn't know where he'd start. He said it to a few people, and particularly a good friend of his, Willie Spring, in Castlemaine. And Willie agreed with him. Willie walked with him. They started canvassing co-ops, little small creameries. Would they think of doing this? A lot of them were sceptical of what they were trying to do, but they came on board with his idea. Still, it was only an idea. He then brought this to the County Committee of Agriculture, where Mr. Eddie Hayes was very involved in that organisation as well at the time. Dad was very persuasive, and he worked his magic with Eddie. And Eddie decided, yes, it would be a good idea that if we had just a Kerry rather than Kerry and Limerick, it would be a whole Kerry brand. So the idea grew and grew, but it came to the stage who was going to spearhead this idea. It was still only an idea. As I say, my father was very involved. He had a lot of work, a lot of late nights, a lot of going to farmers, but my father at the same time couldn't do any of this only for having an excellent wife at home who took up the pieces. She was the breadwinner for a lot of the time. She milked the cows, she did everything. It allowed my father to be out on the road, canvassing for support for this, and basically they had a good team. They worked well together. That was basically it. My mother was Frances O'Shea, maiden name Frances O'Sullivan, from just across the Lown in Kilbinane. She was a qualified nurse. She had a public health, general and midwifery, but as everyone knows, at that time you couldn't be working and be married at the time, so she had to give up her nursing and she stayed at home farming, which she embraced with every fibre in her body, and she loved it. She worked alongside my father, but mainly she worked alongside her family, because my father was always on the road at some meeting somewhere, because as anyone can understand, there was a lot of meetings when you were setting up something as big as what was Kerry Co-op at the time. My father had a lot of interests in his life. One was his family, of course. One was politics. We'll say the political side of things. He was very involved in that. He was also involved in farming politics. He loved GA. Oh my God, did he love GA. I'd say he was at every All-Ireland since he was about 10 years of age that Kerry ever played. He loved reading. He loved history, archaeology, architecture. He loved anything to do with that. And his pastime was fishing. He loved fishing. Now, he was a very stubborn man. Everyone says they can see where I get it from. But he was kind, and he was the kind of man, he would give the last penny he had to someone if he thought they needed it more than him. He had a great heart. He went to John of God's to be dried out, as luck should have it. His last drink was 11:30 on the 7th of May 1985. and my father never touched a drop of drink to the day he died on the 23rd of June 2021. Never touched a drop of drink in that number of years. He was very strong-willed, and when he said he'd do it, he would do it. Just at the kitchen table in the morning, or maybe at the dinner table the following day when we'd come home from school, that all this would be discussed again. He was very frustrated that people couldn't see his vision of what Kerry Co-op could be. It got him down a bit. In later years, as he was on the board of Kerry Co-op, and it is one thing he always said to me, whatever type of politics I get into, never get into farming politics, because it's the dirtiest of all politics. In later years, when my father was on the board, it wasn't a case of your ability. You had to have support from IFA and ICMSA. You first had to be a member of the local advisory committee, then you got onto the county, and then you were elected onto the board. And yes, my father often came home at night and he would cry with frustration, but at the same time he loved it. And I know for a fact if he had his life all over again, he wouldn't change one thing. He loved farming and he was very proud. He didn't boast about it, he never spoke about it, he never talked to anyone about it, but he was very proud of what Kerry did become in later years. When Kerry was formed, it was an amalgamation of Kerry's farmers in Kerry supplying milk to the co-op. It was produce that was made from the milk that they were producing. But in later years, they've diversified into food ingredients and different types of things. So the actual milk, the milk side of things, is only a very, very small fraction now. No one could have foreseen it would get so globally so big, but it really was Dennis Brosnan that pushed the whole thing. He pushed the idea. He just created something massive. My father was supplying milk to Beaufort Creamery, but in later years, Beaufort Creamery then supplied milk to Castlemaine Creameries, and that was a region, likes of Disgrove, Listowel, Killarney Dairies, different regions. He was representing that, but to get on the board, Dad had first of all to be an advisory on his own areas such as Beaufort, and then he had to get on the board of Castlemaine. And then people that voted in the Castlemaine area voted him onto the board. I have some great memories of farming in my earlier years. My father made silage where very few around at the time was making silage. The process was, it was cut with the finger barb mower. He'd come along then with the buck rake and back under it and make a pit in the field. And at that particular time, there was no black plastic. It was all white plastic. Everything was done with small tractors. My father hoard with two other neighbours here locally, Denny Coffey, Lotte Mercenham and James Dial, and they'd all cut each other's. My father would cut with a 135, James Dial would put it up with a 135, and Denny Coffey was drawing with a 42000, and that was the gear they had. I remember my father had the 135, and he had a trip loader and a one-board plough, and the mountain land that he turned and reclaimed and lifted rocks. Some lovely memories, except for the time when land was receded and we had to pick stones, pull ragwort. They were memories I do not like. The cows here at home were hand milked up to 61. It was before my time, but in 61 Dad put in one of the first herringbone parlours around at the time. It was a novelty. There was no excavators at the time, so the actual pit in the parlour couldn't be dug out, so the pit was ground level and where the cow stood was risen up. So in the yard, the collecting yard as we'd call it, there had to be a step to break the rise, so the cow would jump up on the step to get into the parlour. But there was a story told of two gentlemen met at the local bridge one morning, and one asked the other, "Have you been up to see the new machine above by Jimmy Shea?" "I have," he said. "I was above for my gallon of milk this morning." "And how's he getting on?" "Oh, he's an awful job. The cows, others are so big, they have to jack the cows up now to get him into the parlour." This was the thing that was told. In later years, I have great memories. My neighbour who hand milked 15 cows, and we often gave him a hand, and if we came around the door without acknowledging that we were coming, if we surprised him, he'd squirt the shot of milk out at us into the face. And my mother in later years had a hatchery here. She reared her own turkeys. She hatched out the turkeys, and she would have anything up to 250, 300 oven-ready turkeys for Christmas. A lot of work involved in them. plucking, cleaning them out. We used to love the plucking because we'd be jumping inside in the feathers, and there would be a lot of feathers out of maybe 200 or 300 turkeys. And then Christmas time, going door to door, dropping off the turkeys to different people. Kerry Co-op, it has made substantial changes in the county. One of the biggest changes that are there is the availability of money. And where the money came from is shares that farmers acquired over the years. When the Co-op became a PLC, farmers were able to cash in their shares. They have made it easier for farmers to invest in their holding and buy machinery, build bigger milking parlours, buy more land. It just made it easier. They don't always have to be going to the bank with a handout. They had the money at their disposal. Within 12 months of I taking over the farm, my mother got Alzheimer's and she died in 2007. But the way my father turned around and looked after my mother for the last number of years of her life was nothing but phenomenal. He did everything for that woman. He was her hands, her feet, her voice. He was everything for her. And I don't think there's a man around that would equal what he did for that mother. And for that reason, I have the greatest admiration for my father. My father was in sound mind up to a couple of weeks before he passed away at the age of 90 years and a half. The papers, every paper had to be got, 2 or 3 papers a day had to be got for him. And he loved his family around him. He was very happy towards the end of his time.
I wish to say a sincere thank you to Kieran O'Shea. Thank you too to Charlie Nelligan for concertina music. You have been listening to a podcast series, episode 4, from A Chat with Mary, Voices from Kerry Co-op's Story. This is Mary Lavery Carrig, and thank you for listening.